friends. Today we gonna see top 5 most disturbing experiments performed on humans. Welcome. 2. Factology. Number 1. Syphilis Study. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a clinical study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, from 1932 to 1972 in Macon County, Alabama, to observe the natural progression of syphilis in African American men who were diagnosed with the disease but were not treated. The study was conducted without the informed consent of the participants and included various unethical practices, including deception, withholding of treatment, and coercion. The study initially involved 600 African American men, 399 of whom had syphilis, and 201 who did not have the disease, the control group. The men were recruited from the surrounding rural area and were primarily sharecroppers and uneducated. They were told that they were being treated for bad blood, a term used to describe a range of illnesses, including anemia and fatigue. The study's researchers initially provided some of the men with free medical care, including meals, physical exams, and treatment for minor ailments. However, the researchers did not provide treatment for syphilis, despite the fact that effective treatments for the disease became available in the mid-1940s. Over the course of the study, the researchers intentionally deceived the men, telling them that they were receiving treatment for their disease when, in fact, they were not. The researchers also prevented the men from receiving treatment elsewhere, even when some of the men actively sought it out. As a result of the study's unethical conduct, many of the men suffered serious health consequences, including blindness, deafness, and other neurological problems. Some of the men's wives and children also contracted the disease. The study resulted in the deaths of 28 of the participants from syphilis-related complications, and an additional 100 participants died from related causes, such as heart disease and stroke, that were also linked to the untreated syphilis. In the mid-1960s, a PHS investigator named Peter Buxton learned of the study's unethical conduct and began to advocate for its termination. When it was finally exposed in a newspaper article. Number 2. Holmesburg Prison Experiment. The Holmesburg Prison Experiment was a series of unethical medical experiments conducted on inmates at the Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, USA from 1951 to 1974. The experiments were funded by the United States government and carried out by medical researchers from the University of Pennsylvania. Here are some of the most unethical and inhumane experiments that were carried out. Dermatological experiments. Inmates were subjected to a range of dermatological experiments, including tests on the effects of various skin irritants and chemicals, and studies on the effectiveness of new drugs and treatments for skin diseases. Many of the tests caused severe skin damage and scarring, and some resulted in permanent disfigurement. Inmates were exposed to high levels of radiation, both internally and externally, to test the effects of radiation on the human body. This included injecting radioactive isotopes into the bloodstream and exposing inmates to radiation from X-rays and other sources. Many inmates suffered from radiation sickness and other serious health problems as a result. Inmates were given various psychotropic drugs, including LSD and mescaline, to study the effects of these drugs on the human mind. Many of the subjects suffered from severe mental and emotional disturbances as a result of these experiments. Inmates were deliberately infected with a range of infectious diseases, including hepatitis and herpes, to test new treatments and drugs. Many of the subjects suffered from serious health problems as a result of these experiments. Inmates were also subjected to a range of other experiments, including studies on the effects of cigarette smoke on the lungs, and tests on the effectiveness of new vaccines and treatments for various diseases. The experiments at Holmesburg Prison were widely criticized for their unethical nature, and many of the subjects suffered long-term health problems as a result of their participation. The experiments were eventually shut down in 1974 after a public outcry, and the researchers involved faced significant criticism for their actions. Number 3. mkultra. The mkultra was a top-secret mind control research program conducted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, from the 1950s to the 1970s. The program aimed to develop techniques and substances for mind control and interrogation purposes. Here are some of the most unethical and inhumane experiments that were carried out. LSD experiments. One of the most well-known mkultra experiments involved the administration of LSD to unsuspecting individuals, including soldiers, CIA agents, and even mental health patients. The goal was to study the effects of the drug on behavior and to determine if it could be used for mind control purposes. The program also included experiments on hypnosis and brainwashing techniques. Researchers attempted to control and manipulate individuals by inducing a hypnotic state or through various forms of psychological manipulation. Another area of experimentation involved sensory deprivation. Participants were subjected to long periods of isolation and sensory deprivation to study the effects on their psychological and cognitive functioning. The mkultra program also experimented with electroshock therapy to alter individuals' behavior and memory. The treatment involved administering electric shocks to the brain to induce seizures and memory loss. In some experiments, participants were forced to remain awake for extended periods of time, sometimes for several days at a time. The aim was to study the effects of sleep deprivation on cognitive functioning and behavior. The program was highly controversial and was ultimately exposed in the 1970s. The mkultra program was officially terminated in 1973, and many of the records and documents related to the program were destroyed. Number 4. Unit 731. During World War II, Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army under the direction of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. The unit was located in the Pingfang district of Harbin, China, and was responsible for some of the most heinous war crimes in history. They carried out experiments on Chinese, Koreans, Russians, and Mongolians, including men, women, children, and infants. Prisoners of war, civilians, and even its own soldiers were subjected to a range of horrific experiments. Here are some of the most unethical and inhumane experiments that were carried out by Unit 731. Vivisection. One of the most infamous experiments conducted by Unit 731 was vivisection, the dissection of living subjects. Prisoners of war and other individuals were operated on without anesthesia, and their organs were removed to study the effects of various diseases and injuries. Frostbite testing. Prisoners were exposed to freezing temperatures for extended periods of time to study the effects of frostbite. Limbs were often left untreated until they became gangrenous, at which point they were amputated. Infectious disease experiments. Unit 731 conducted experiments to study the effects of various diseases, including bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, and others. Prisoners were deliberately infected with these diseases, often resulting in agonizing deaths. Weapon testing. The unit also conducted tests on various weapons, including grenades and bombs filled with biological agents. These were often tested on live prisoners, who were tied to stakes and subjected to the explosions. High-altitude testing. Prisoners were subjected to high altitudes to study the effects of low air pressure on the human body. Many died as a result of the experiment. Other experiments. Unit 731 also conducted experiments involving human anatomy, nutrition, and sterilization, among others. Probably, this was one of the most terrifying human experiments in history. It is estimated that around 220,000 people were killed during the unit's operations. Number 5. The Angel of Death. Joseph Mengele was a German physician and SS officer during World War II who conducted a range of experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps. He was known as the Angel of Death, for his inhumane and cruel experiments on human subjects. Here are some of the most notorious experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele without anesthesia. Twin studies. Mengele had a particular fascination with twins and conducted a series of experiments on them to study heredity. Twins were subjected to a range of experiments, including injections of deadly diseases, amputations, and blood transfusions. Eye color experiments. Mengele sought to change the eye color of prisoners by injecting dyes into their eyes, causing severe pain and leading to blindness in many cases. Bone, muscle, and nerve experiments. Mengele removed limbs from living prisoners to study the regeneration of bone, muscle, and nerve tissue, often leaving them to bleed to death. Infectious disease experiments. Mengele deliberately infected prisoners with diseases such as tuberculosis, typhus, and smallpox to study their effects, resulting in many deaths. Sterilization experiments. Mengele subjected women to invasive procedures, including hysterectomies and castrations, without anesthesia to study methods of sterilization. Mengele also conducted experiments on prisoners using various chemicals and poisons, as well as experiments on human aging and physical characteristics. It is estimated that Mengele conducted experiments on thousands of prisoners, the majority of whom died or were killed as a result. After the war, Mengele fled to South America and lived in hiding until his death in 1979.